again, I'm just going to keep preaching this until people come around to this. Why are you saying there's no distinctions in the law of God in the New Testament? What's motivating you? I think it's not hard to tell. There's not only indication in the New Testament of that, which I showed in my last video. And by the way, if you see this truth and you ignore it and then ignore the reality of it, you're lying to yourself. You're living a lie. Just a heads up. You might wake up one day and realize, oh, I'm just living a lie. Especially if you're teaching it to other people. But it's in the Old Testament too. And it's actually like pretty obvious. It's pretty much demanded. Listen to this. This is the Old Covenant, Samuel. Talk about Saul. And Saul said, they've brought them from the Amalekites for the people, spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed. So he hears the sheep. I think you're supposed to destroy the sheep and the people. And he's like, Samuel said to Saul, be quiet, and I will tell you what the Lord said to me last night. And he said to him, speak on. So Samuel said, when you were little in your own eyes, were you not head of the tribes of Israel? And did not the Lord anoint you king over Israel? Now the Lord sent you on a mission and said, go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the spoil and do evil in the sight of the Lord? And Saul said to Samuel, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord and gone on the mission on which the Lord sent me, and brought back Agag, king of Amalek. I have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people took of the plunder, sheep and oxen, the best of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, in order to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal. So Samuel said, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice. Now, let me ask you, is the sacrifices part of the Old Covenant? And does God care to heed to the fat of rams? For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is an iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. So he didn't obey God's word, what he said, what God said, because he wants to do sacrifices. And the Lord's like, I don't care about sacrifices. Listen to what I say. I've sinned and transgressed the commandment of the Lord because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Let's look at another one. So, does God make a distinction? Why would God say that? It's one law. Would they need to do the sacrifices or extra sacrifices or any sacrifices if they weren't disobeying God? Is that the same thing? And I've tried to say this before. Is it the same thing that they need to do sacrifices because of sins? What do those sacrifices do? Jesus died on it. Jesus has to die for their sins. The Passover, for instance, is when the angel of death passed over because they had the blood. He didn't kill the firstborn of the sons. Is that different than needing sacrifices for ultimately a Messiah and animal sacrifices typing it for no reason at all? God just always said do sacrifices for sins, whether you have sins or not. No. Or is there something that requires them to need sacrifices, which are a typology of what Jesus does to save people from their sins? So obviously, yes, there's things that aren't. Not doing the animal sacrifices on the day after you've just been cleansed, say on the Day of Atonement, you haven't sinned, and then the next day you could do sacrifices or not. Would God be mad that you didn't do sacrifices when you didn't need to do any sacrifices because you hadn't sinned? Wait, it's all equal. To not do the sacrifice is sin. No. The sacrifices are added because of sins. And now that you need those, it's a sin to not do the sacrifices. But once you don't need the sacrifices anymore, it's not the same thing. But moral disobedience that affects relationships and one's own life. The problem is that people think the commandments of God are burdensome rather than good. And so they literally hate God's law and think Jesus saved them from the law. That's the problem. When I'm talking about the law, I'm not making the mistake that most people make and say it means everything from the old covenant. But there is a context where it is talking about the whole thing. And when it is, it means just the whole covenant agreement, which is everything. But that's a different category. So when it seems that the context is saying everything, the whole law, it's because it's talking about in context of old versus new covenant. But other times it's not doing that. That's why Paul can say, we delight in the law of God, even though it's like, why are you going back under the law? You're falling from grace. And then other times he says, the Spirit in us writes the law in our heart and makes us walk and obey God's commandments. And by the way, circumcision doesn't matter, part of the old covenant law, part of the whole law. But then he says the commandments do matter. That's what really matters. That's called a distinction. And it's obvious, people. Why are you rejecting it? Because you don't want to keep the Sabbath. That's all it is. Okay. You don't want to do the one commandment that you can actually it's not even doing anything. Of course, it doesn't imply that you work during the week and then you take the one day off to honor God. But let me see. Where is that? I lost it. There we go. Yeah, there we go. Is the law the same there? If Jesus took away the whole thing, including the things that define the sins that you need salvation for, when he took away the animal sacrifices, no, he took away the covenant agreement and aspects of it, which were types of what he does to forgive us for sins, which were also defined by God's law. So the covenant, the old covenant, is come to the new covenant. Same God, no more sacrifices. Jesus fulfills that. Sins are still sins. Is that sacrifice and God's commandments the same thing? They transgressed the covenant. They were treacherous with me. They commit lewdness. Is lewdness still a sin? That comes from the law of Moses. It's kind of obvious. I guess since nobody comes to my live streams anymore, it's rather clear that they have no more arguments. Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, and rebuke the oppressor, defend the fatherless, plead for the widow. That was always true, by the way. That's from Isaiah. Though you offer me burnt offerings and your grain offerings, I will not accept them, nor will I regard your fattened peace offerings. Fattened means we're going to do extra ritual performances of what's called the ceremonial law. Oh, but you don't want to make those distinctions because Paul doesn't use the term ceremonial. Well, then what did Jesus save us from? Being mean? Why did every Christian writer and doctor of the church, from the early church fathers to the scholastics to the Catholics and Orthodox and the early Protestants and everybody until about 1900 make the distinction in some way or another. Why do the Jews make the same distinction, ancient and current? And even the people who claim you can't make a distinction in the law of every type do end up making distinctions in the law. Why? Because they don't need to do sacrifices anymore. But they recognize that like murdering people is bad. It's so obvious that you can almost get away with pretending like it's not a thing. And it's so obvious. It's like, well, I'm not saying that. No, yes, you are. You're saying the whole thing's done away with. Part of it, look, do not murder is in there. If you're saying the whole thing's done away with, or you're doing away with the Sermon on the Mount, which is an interpretation. It's not feasible. You're lying to yourself when you say that. Even if dispensationalism is true, it's still true that we're all humans. And the same thing that defines sin for one is a sin for another. A lot of Christians are living lies, very, very profound lies.